want to find theta, this theta is what you check the dimensions.
I have not.
Hello. Like this course is going on the back.
Right, because you were
You finished number 1? So, first one.
Okay, so I just
Right, let's get started. This is the last real lecture that we'll have today. The next one is mostly going to be a big picture overview of what we've been doing and general words of wisdom. So let's start with announcements as always. You have an exam next week, next Thursday. Yeah, no kidding. It's going to be from 1 to 3 p.m. and as of now it's scheduled in this room. It is in this room. If there's any change, I'll send out an email. And I'll be putting up a bunch of sample questions just like I did for the midterm, most likely by the end of tomorrow. It should show up on the website. And if you have any questions, you can either email the group or maybe bring them up on Monday. And there's also a homework due because you have a lot of time. So there's a homework due on Monday, and I hope that's going well. And as if that's not enough, there's also a project due, but I've extended, as I mentioned, I've made the project report deadline. It's now May 6th, and I've updated the website. That's the last day of the exam period, and as always, you have until midnight May 6th, or if you choose to lose 10%, you can go till May 7th. Questions about any of these things? I notice also that the class has become rather sparse. Yeah, I know. Not surprising, but yes.
You said the final would be as hard as the midterm.
But the final will be as you have. It's a 2-hour final. The midterm was 1 hour something minutes. So you'll have more time to think about stuff, and it shouldn't be terribly hard. At least, yeah.
How did you read the midterm anyway? I mean,
So the midterm, I must say,
terribly
so the midterm, I rated it as moderate. It was not terribly hard, it was not terribly easy, it was somewhat longish. The primary problem with the midterm was that it was long, and this was after me chopping half of it out. But no, that's fine. I mean, it's fine for me, but it shouldn't be terribly hard. Let's put it that way. It might not be a piece of cake, but I'm not going to ask you to, prove an unsolved problem. And it's not on the bright side, if you're not able to do it, someone else is also not able to do it. So I don't know if that's a bright side or not, but that's also true. Questions about? Let's start with the homework. Questions about the homework? Yes.
So I'm confused about when we are taking the probability. So when we want to take the likelihood of the data given the parameters, or the likelihood of the parameters given the data. Because I understand likelihood of parameters given the data. I don't understand what it means to take the likelihood of the data given the parameters.
So it's a good question, because that takes us back to maximum likelihood estimation. So what we really want is, let's start with the maximum a posteriori. What we really want is probability of parameters given, I'm going to use S for data. And we want to find the best parameters. This is the one that we want to maximize. But our model tells us, our model does not really give us this. What this is equal to maximizing, or as you pointed out the other day, I should be using Rmaxes. So let's stick to that. So this is what we want to find. And this is equal to right? This is just base load. And this is map estimation. Now, if I'm maxing over theta, the denominator is constant, so I can get rid of it. So this is right. So this is what we need to do for maximum a posteriori estimation, maximum posterior distribution of the parameters given the data. Now, maximum likelihood assumption starts with this and makes another assumption. So far we have not made any assumptions. This is generally a good thing to do. Map estimation makes an assumption. No, not map. Maximum likelihood estimation assumes that P of theta is a constant. So all parameters are equally likely. Now, if your parameters are actually an infinite set, this is not really, you need to distribute your probabilities equally across the infinite set. It's called an improper prime. You just pretend that P of theta is a constant. Then, if that is the case, then this becomes equal to so this is why we get maximum likelihood estimation being find the best parameters is equivalent to finding the parameters that maximize the likelihood of the data. Does that resolve your question?
Can you talk about how we're mixing map and MLE?
We're not mixing it. This is MLE is map plus this assumption.
Okay.
Map is maximum a posteriori estimation requires you to maximize this quantity. Now, if this was constant, it's not a function of theta, it gets deleted. That's why we get this.
Okay.
Yes.
So when you're talking about generating S given theta, we talk about the labels as well as the
Yes.
right?
Now that's a good point. Now S looks like this, right?
Yes.
And now you need to think about what your model gives you. Your model, it could be a discriminative model. If it's a discriminative model, so let's discriminative versus generative. A generative model, let's start with that one, that's easier. Generative model has something to say about probability of xi, yi given. This is how the model is defined. This is the assumptions that you make. So naive Bayes is a generative model because it assigns a probability to the full joint assignment. In which case you just plug this into this and you know that every element here is independent, so this becomes the product of all those things and we do the usual stuff. If it's a discriminative model, your parameters only have something to say about P of yi given xi and theta. So logistic regression falls in this category, right? But P of s given theta still, I'm going to continue here, so this is, let's put arrows. So P of s given theta is simply P of xi yi given theta. And that's the product over I. Right? But if my model only tells me about this, and I need to somehow get to this one, how do we do that? Who's who said that? I can't.
I said
Yes.
marginalize.
You marginalize, yes. So you can write this as product P of yi given xi upon theta times P of xi given theta. These two are equal, but now and your model has something to say about this quantity. Your model has nothing to say about this. And in particular, in a discriminative model, your model doesn't care about this. It does not care about how the inputs are generated, because that's not part of the model's, that's not even under consideration. So that gets dropped. That's effectively treated as independent of theta, because your parameters only have something to say about this. So that becomes independent of theta, so that disappears, and you end up maximizing. So since you are maximizing, you can just maximize this product. So the way to get from P of S given theta to something that's in terms of your parameters depends on whether you are in a discriminative or a generative regime. And in both cases, you assume that you know that your examples are drawn independently of each other. So you write this as a product, and then you apply whichever one your model has any voice about. Yes.
So, and the problem said that xj was a real value feature.
Yes.
So we are talking, and each feature now has a normal distribution.
Right. In the problem, in fact, there's actually still a little bit more, because which one is this? Is this naive base, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we don't worry about this. We are in this. Here, this is a vector. So the P of xi, yi is really P of xi1, xi2, xi3 till xid, yi. It's d plus 1 things here. And you decompose it according to the naive Bayes assumption, because the naive Bayes, I'm going to erase, shall I erase this part?
Yes.
Hold on, he's taking a picture. So the naive Bayes, x being a vector and y given whatever parameters is it makes this assumption. Oh, I made a mistake here. Makes this assumption. And the problem asks you to work in the regime that this guy is a normal distribution. And it's a normal distribution it's a normal distribution that's got a mean that's dependent on the y, and a standard deviation that's also dependent on the y.
But it's also dependent on the j itself. Like.
Oh, of course. So there is a mu yj effectively, and a sigma yj mean. So there are d dimensions. Let's say this is a d-dimensional vector. There will be one set of means, d means, for y equals 0, and another set of d means for y equals 1. There will be d sigmas for y equals 0 and d sigmas for y equals 1. And this guy is basically just a number. Where this is either when y equals 1, it's let's say p, when y equals 0, it's 1 minus p. Yes.
So at this point, could you just use the probability density function to...
Yes, yes. And you need to take log, take the derivative, set it to 0,
Right.
and do all that fun stuff.
But isn't it multi-dimension or multivariate density function?
Well, you got rid of the multi-dimension.
I got rid of the multi-dimensions because I assume that the different dimensions are independent of each other, conditionally independent given the label. So if you think of it as multivariate Gaussian, the covariance matrix is a diagram. That's exactly what's going on here. Other questions? Now this is generally an important thing to know, and the idea of map MLE is important because when you want to apply these ideas out in the wild, there are two kinds of problems that we face. Problems that you know how to solve, like where you just are going to throw an existing learning algorithm or a classifier at it, in which case you really don't have to derive any of this, because it's all done for you. But if you run into a case where you want to make interesting new independence assumptions, then you have to redirect the whole thing. And it's a good exercise to actually know how to do it. And the same thing also for the EM kind of stuff. If it's in the EM world, if it's a problem that has already been solved, if it's a named problem, it has been solved. But in most interesting problems that you might want to eventually work on, won't be named problems. So you might have to actually know how to do the dirty work. Yes.
In the Knight-Biggs equation, shouldn't the multiplication be over even the probability of y given theta?
What do you mean?
That's just the multiplication over.
So there is a probability of y given theta here.
But you're doing it for all the examples.
No, this is for one example.
Right.
This is for a particular example. When there will be another, if you're doing it over all examples, there will be a product here, there will be a product here, over all x1. Yes.
So in the expectation maximization we did last time, the punchline is you have at the end is you're taking the expectation of a log of the probability.
Right.
I don't understand how to do that computationally. I don't understand how you actually compute
Which one?
the expectation of a log of the probability. Yeah.
This one?
Yes. How do you actually get that term?
How do you get it, or how do you wait? How do you write down that function, or how do you compute the max? Which one are you asking about?
Given some data, I don't understand how you figure out what the expectation of the log of the probability
It's
is.
expectation according to a particular distribution.
Okay.
It's expectation according to this distribution that you've computed. So we can write it. So I'm going to erase this and use the whiteboard for EM. If there are any questions about this, we can use this else going. Back. Oh, so let me just, before getting into this, the plan for today, at least on paper, was to do two things. Continue on this exploration of EM and talk about hard EM, and I'll point out connections to clustering, very explicit connections to clustering. And then my plan was to also talk about dimensionality reduction and feature selection and such kind of things, which are good to know. There's not much technical meat there that you may not have already seen either in a linear algebra class or in some sort of a heuristic-y way that you might have invented yourself. But I'll be happy to skip that part if we can actually, if there are questions about this. Because those things you can learn yourself. Those are things that show up in multiple classes. I think EM is more central to machine learning, and it's something that you should understand. So I would rather spend time on this unless you have strong objections. So let's basically try to work out this process. You have the log of, let's go from inside out. So you have probability of xi, yi given theta. And because we have a generative model, the generative model tells us how this is functionally defined. That's basically the definition of a generative model. You have to make an assumption. For example, the naive Bayes assumes that this is p of yi given theta times p of or such things. The generative model, so the first step that you need to make is an assumption about how you believe the data is generated, how you believe the joint distribution is generated. So you need to write down some functional form for this. So I'm going to erase this, but for the rest of this discussion, you have to work under the assumption that we have a functional form for this in terms of x, y, and theta. Okay? If you have a functional form, you can easily write down the log of that. It may not be a nice function, it may not be pretty, but you can write it down. the real question is, what is the expectation? So the generative model tells us about P of xi, yi given theta, but our data only has xi's. So this yi doesn't exist. There is no yi. The expectation is taken over the y's, and this is by definition equals sum over y, and this is y drawn from q. So q of yi of y times this is just the definition of the expectation. Now we've already computed the q of y, right? The q of y in the E step is the probability that the label for this particular example, so it should be qi. For this particular example, qi of y is the probability that the label, according to the previous set of parameters that we had, this is the probability that the label will be y. And at this point, this is just a number. So there's no variable here. The only variables here are, the only unknown here is theta. So this entire thing, if you notice, is a function of theta and x and y. Sorry, this is a function of theta and xi. Those are the only two things that are not self-contained here. Now, this guy is a function that we know how to write because our model assumed it. Log of that, we know how to take log. This is a constant, so effectively this whole thing is some function. I'm just going to call it capital F of xi and theta. So we can write down the function. The EM algorithm simply says, or the maximization step is simply maximize that function. Now, very often what happens is we know, suppose we know we want to solve this, and we really don't want to do too much work computationally. So the best way to do it is to make an assumption about the probability so that the math works out nicely. And well, I mean, you can't just make assumptions that the probability is always zero. That's just a bogus assumption. So you need to make reasonable assumptions that reflect the real world, and so that this function, this whole thing, you can take the derivative with respect to theta and set it to 0 and compute the value of thetas. So finding the argmax over theta of this. So there's nothing until this step. There was no computation going on. This was entirely on paper. Here you may choose to either use some optimization algorithm for this if it is not a very pleasant function, or in the cases that we've seen with the 3 coins or with naive Bayes, this can be computed analytically. So this computation happens on paper. So this entire EM algorithm in both the examples that we saw, even the one that we'll see next, is entirely implemented on, well, not implemented, entirely derived on paper. The actual algorithm is just a series of counting, with iterative counts, keeping counts, that's it. Does that? Other questions? But to pop the stack back a bit, are there any questions about projects or finals that you want to, that something urgent or something that you might want to use? Questions about EM? That was a good question because I was planning to do this anyway on the whiteboard, so it worked out very well. So, in the last lecture we actually worked through, not entirely, but I gave you the general overview and I told that you should probably do the derivation and stuff at home. We went through how EM is instantiated for naive Bayes, and basically the M step, I just walked through this process. You expand log likelihood, you write down the expectation, take the derivative with respect to the parameters, set them to 0, get new updates, and iterate. And I also said work out these steps on paper. I hope you did. Yeah. But you should be getting something like this. Remember in naive Bayes with fully labeled data, the probability that the label, we had naive Bayes requires P, AJ and BJ, where P is the probability that Y is 1 before you see an example. And the most reasonable thing to do before you even thought of naive Bayes, some of you suggested, just count how many times Y equals 1 in the data, divide by the total number of examples, that's P. And it turns out if you do maximum likelihood estimation with naive Bayes, that's exactly what you get. Here, with EM for naive Bayes, you get a function that's very similar. Instead of counts, you have soft counts. And the soft counts are simply, remember that for every example, the E step estimated this quantity here. What is the probability that this example will take a label Y? So soft count of Y equals 1 is just the sum of those probabilities. And similarly, the other soft counts are defined. In the non-EM case, it's just counts. So effectively, doing EM on this particular model gives you a very natural interpretation for the way you update your parameters at each iteration. Questions? Either the end of the semester has made you really, really shy, or you understand everything, and either way you're not speaking. So just to sum up this discussion about EM, it's a family of algorithms which follow the same template. There's an E step where you estimate according to current parameters what is the probability over the hidden variables. Probability of the hidden variables taking certain values. So just to remind you, the setup is you have inputs, you believe there are outputs, but you don't have any labels for that. So you hallucinate some parameters first, use those parameters to make an estimate for what those hidden variables are. You don't estimate the value of the hidden variables, you estimate distributions over them. And in the M step, you try to update these parameters by saying, get me new parameters that maximize the expected log likelihood. And a couple of lectures back, we saw why expected log likelihood is a natural thing to do. It shows up by using Jensen's inequality on the actual likelihood. But it's a family of algorithms. Yes?
So this is really just Occam's razor, isn't it?
Which one?
Just the idea of trying to find the most likely explanation for whatever data you get.
Not quite. There is a connection between just maximum likelihood maximum posteriori and Occam's razor. But in EM, the objective that we wanted to maximize was the likelihood of the complete data, which gives you an expression that is sum over all examples of log of sum over all hidden variables, basically marginalize all hidden variables of the likelihood. But summing over log is unpleasant. No. Maximizing a function that looks like of something. Maximizing this is unpleasant, and so we come up with an iterative procedure that keeps maximizing something that looks like this. So, and this iterative procedure will converge to the local maximum of that original function, and it's a tight. The connection between these two is that you're guaranteed to get to some local maximum, but this function is not convex, so you don't know which one. You might get different results for different initializations. But yes, there is a connection between wanting to find the maximum of this and Occam's razor, the most likely explanation. So just to repeat the something that I mentioned before, if you see a new problem, you might have to rederive the whole thing. You can't just use update rules that you've seen because they might be for a different model. So based on your generative model, you have to rederive EM, and sometimes it can get rather nastier. The other thing is that this is a general idea that's very useful, and a lot of algorithms that deal with unlabeled or missing variables end up looking a lot like this, a lot like EM. There's an iterative algorithm. So first of all, typically when you have latent variables, the objective that you want to minimize ends up being non-convex. Typically, depending on what your perspective on life is, you might choose different kinds of objectives, but there are always two kinds of steps. First, there's a step where you complete the data using current model. Using your current estimate of the parameters, you fill in the hidden variables. And then you use the filled in hidden variables and the observation that you have, so you have complete data, so you re-estimate the parameters. And you alternate between these two phases. EM is probably the oldest algorithm in this family, but there have been many algorithms of this kind. Typically all of them end up being non-convex, which means there are no guarantees of convergence. Some of them have worse guarantees than EM in terms of there's no guarantee that you'll get to any local maximum. You just write an algorithm and hope it works. That's really not a nice place to be, but sometimes we don't have a choice. There are interesting latent variable extensions to support vector machines, to even the perceptron algorithm, and in fact this is a very hot area of research. So now I'm going to talk about one variant of EM, which is called the hard EM, and point out how it connects to a popular clustering algorithm. So remember that the E step in EM asks you to find the probability that let me write it down so that we have it for comparison. In the E step, let's say you have your current parameters are some theta t, you use this to find an estimate for the probability that this example will be assigned this label using your current parameters. And then you use it to do whatever you want. A variant of this is called hard EM, where instead of finding these kinds of soft counts, you find that label that maximizes this probability and pretend that that example was assigned that label. So the difference is in hard EM, you use your theta t to find, so in EM you effectively complete your data as xi comma this distribution. In hard EM you say xi comma you find that label that has the highest probability for each example, and this is basically, once you do that, you have complete data, and you can use whatever learning algorithm internally, but you can do basically maximum likelihood estimation as the M step. So that's the intuition behind a hard EM, and I'll continue on. I'll give you some examples. So another equivalent way of thinking about it is this label that you chose as the argmax. Let's say this the original distribution was some distribution that had different values for each label. Let's say take multi-class classification. It's a distribution over different labels. You find the one that maximizes it, and then create another distribution where that is 1 and everything else is 0. So you just change the probability estimates so that it's completely all the probability mass is on that one label that maximizes it. And now you have another version of Q. Basically this is a probability distribution. You can plug it into EM and let it run. And this is just one variant of EM that's popularly seen, and there are good reasons for using this, because sometimes just finding the one label that is most likely is computationally easier than finding the entire distribution. And this is especially true when your labels are, when the number of your labels is really large, maybe infinite. So you don't want to store the distribution, but you know how to store one example. There are many other variants of EM. They have fun names like variational EM, MC EM, and what else? Generalized EM, which is kind of a goofy name in my opinion. And there's also, there are many versions of EM. So I won't be talking about this, but these different versions of EM are tweaks on the basic idea that we saw in EM. And I'm talking only about we'll only talk about hard EM in this class. And in particular, I want to instantiate hard EM for a particular model. So again, when we do EM, we need to first make an assumption about how the data is generated, and then define the E and the M steps and look at how your parameters are obtained. Just to add some spice in your life, I want to introduce a new model. This is called the mixture of Gaussians, or the Gaussian mixture model. And examples in this is applicable in the following regime. Your examples are d-dimensional vectors, real valued vectors. And your labels, there can be one of k labels. Let's say this is multi-class classification, where you have every example can be placed into one of these k buckets. And the way this data and the generative model assumes that the way that this data is generated is, first you have a k-sided die that you toss and pick a label. Every label is now associated with a multinomial, a multivariate normal distribution, a normal distribution in d dimensions, and with some mean and covariance matrix, and you pick a random point from, let's say you draw the label to be 1, you take the first normal distribution, draw a random point from that. That gives you 1 point. Then you pick another, that's how you generate a data set. You pick another label, it corresponds to another normal distribution, its own normal distribution. So there are k normal distributions and one k-sided die. Is the generative model clear? Let me walk through an example. The one-dimensional case. The multivariate, what did I call it? The Gaussian mixture model, in this case, let's say there are 3 Gaussians, and our probability is actually some mixture of these 3 Gaussians. And each of them has its own mean, so there are 3 here, this one's mean somewhere here, this one's here, this one's somewhere here. And each of them has a different standard deviation, so the heights are different. And the way you generate the data here is, first sample a label, pick a y. Let's say we have 3 labels, L1, L2, and L3. Pick a y, and in this case we throw a roll a 3-sided die and pick one. Let's say you pick this one. And now the only Gaussian distribution that matters is the one that corresponds to that label, and you draw a random point from it. Let's say you pick that. And you can repeat this multiple times and you'll get a collection of labels and points, pairs, a collection of pairs. In the 2-dimensional case, this becomes something like this. You have 2 Gaussian distributions and you pick a point. First you pick which Gaussian to draw from, and then you select a point from that. Is the generative process clear? Now, the generative model also tells you, well, it's a process that generates the data, but it also tells you how to assign a probability for an input-output pair. If the probability of the input and output is first probability of y times the probability of x given that y. And the probability of x given that y is whichever normal distribution is defined by whichever normal distribution that point corresponds to. So what that means is we can define the likelihood of a point. Suppose we have a point x whose label is Li. Then likelihood of the pair xy is probability of, or x comma li is probability of li times the probability of drawing that point, which is simply, this one corresponds, this is simply a multinomial. Probability of picking li is simply alpha I by definition, and this is from a normal. I'm using the notation n to define the probability density function of a normal distribution whose mean is mu and covariance is sigma. Questions? How many of you have seen Gaussian mixture models before? About 8? No, 4. Okay. Questions from the others? Yes.
When you say likelihood of a point, we're actually asking the likelihood that x equals li?
X equals what?
Li. The,
No. I'm asking, x is a vector, right?
Yeah.
So I'm asking for probability of x comma li, given whatever parameters there are. Because this is a vector, this is in D, and this is in that label set, 1 of k. This. Other questions? Yes.
This looks like clustering.
It does look like clustering. In fact, it will end up being clustering. In fact, let me just give you the punchline right now. If you use Gaussian mixture model and apply the hard EM algorithm, you get the k-means algorithm. How many have seen k-means before or heard of k-means? K-means is rather popular. So this is one interpretation of k-means. If you apply k-means is actually hard EM with a much simpler version of the Gaussian mixture model where the alphas are all uniform and the standard deviation or the variance is basically a diagonal and the identity matrix. Well, I'm going to derive that now, and in fact in general a lot of clustering algorithms have this kind of a whole probabilistic interpretation, because you're assuming something about the data, because if you don't assume anything about the data, you don't know what you're clustering. So typically the assumption in this case ends up being the model. Yes.
So in k-means plus plus, you just change the alpha from being uniform to some other thing, right?
You could,
Yes.
or you could even change the sigmas. So k-means assumes that the points.
K-means plus plus.
Oh yeah, I think that's right. Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
There's some math to be done, but I think you're right. Other questions? So this puts us squarely in the territory of unsupervised learning, which I see as equal to clustering. And unfortunately, there's not enough time left in the semester to spend enough time to discuss clustering in more detail. But on the bright side, this might be late, but there was an entire semester worth of class this time in the CS department on clustering. And if you didn't attend it, well, too bad. But you know, basically clustering is a very rich area which affords a lot of discussion. And what I'm presenting here is not the entire story, clearly. I just want you to keep that in mind. K-means is, and the reason I want to mention that is because K-means ends up being seen as the clustering algorithm. When people say, I want to cluster something, you throw it at K-means and see what comes out. But K-means is just one algorithm, because just like you have, it assumes a certain model and you assume a certain generated model, and K-means is just one way of doing that. You could totally change the assumptions and you'll get a different clustering algorithm. So you should keep that in mind. So let's try to derive K-means. And the setting is, you have a collection of points and you want to assign them, each of them with one of these labels. And the points are real valued. And the end result, at the end of this process, you want to have every point in exactly one bucket, one of these k buckets. Remember, notice that if I did not do hard EM, you will not get one bucket for every point, you'll get a distribution of these buckets for every point. That's the big difference. And I'll repeat this once I've seen this, once we go through this process. And in the answer, because we are in the unsupervised case, we are making an assumption about the model. So we are assuming that the data is generated according to this Gaussian mixture model. So just to simplify things, and that's a lot of text I just realized, just to simplify things, let's assume that all the alphas are equal. There are k possible labels. Let's assume that all of them are equally likely. So each of them, alpha I for all I is 1 over k. And let's also assume that the variances, the covariance matrices for all the k buckets are the identity matrix, which means they're all drawn, every feature in some sense is independent of each other and is drawn from a normal distribution with some unknown mean but a unit variance. Questions about these assumptions? There are two reasons why I'm making these assumptions. One, because it makes the math easier, and two, these are the assumptions that give us k-means. Questions about the setting, about where we are heading? Yeah.
So you said that these assumptions are the things that give you the k-means. Actually, I can't remember what k-means is, but why these are illegitimate kind of assumptions? What is specifically these assumptions that gives us some way of clustering data?
No, there's nothing about these assumptions that give you any way of clustering data. It just so happens that these assumptions give you an algorithm that has a name. That's it. And why did that algorithm have, I don't know, I don't remember the history of k-means, but I don't think it was defined this way. Because k-means, we'll see that, we'll come to the actual algorithm at the end, it's a rather brain-dead thing to do. You don't need any great math to actually invent the algorithm. And very often these kinds of simple things end up emerging out of simplifying assumptions. And this is the simplifying assumption that gives you that algorithm. So, just to make this very clear, the probability of the joint probability of x, y given theta. Now theta is the set of all the means. Remember that the mean is a vector. The mean is, we have k Gaussians, which are all multivariate. So the means are all vectors. And the probability of a point, and theta is the set of all these vectors, set of all mu's. And this is just, the way you generate this data is you first pick a label with probability 1 over k, and then you pick some x according to the normal distribution in d dimensions. So the parameters are all the mu's. So we've done the first thing that we need to do for defining the EM algorithm. We've defined the model. The next thing that we need to do is what? So what do we need to write down an EM algorithm? What? Sorry?
I said labeling the I said labeling the
Right, so E step. So the E step, and the next time I ask you this question, the same question, what's the next thing to do? There must be no surprises. So we'll do the E step, and the way we do that is we want to identify probability that a particular point has a certain label given your current set of parameters. And this is rather easy because we know how to calculate P of xy, and we just take P of xy divided by sum over all y, that gives you P of y given x. And we also know how to write this down as in functional form, and that's just the normal distribution for that particular label L divided by the sum of all the normals. And because we assume that all the alphas are equal, that gets thrown out. So Effectively, the probability of getting of a point taking a certain label is this expression here. It's proportional to e power the distance between that point and the mean, or the square distance. But going back to that kind of a picture that I drew, this is a distribution over the labels for this particular point. So P of y given L, y equals L is just, for each L it gets you a distribution. And if I just continue with this, you will get soft EM, or well, real EM. For hard EM, you want to make this a one hot distribution. All the probability mass is concentrated on one point. You take the one that's the maximum and create a new distribution that has a label 1. Sorry, that has a probability 1 and for that maximizer. But effectively, the only thing that I need to do now is to find which of these labels L maximizes this expression. Right? So what that means is for every point xi, I need to find a label that maximizes e power minus half of xi minus mu L. I need to maximize that expression. But the denominator is common for all labels because it's completely independent of the input label here, it's independent of L. So maximizing that is simply maximizing, and exponent e is e power x is an increasing function, so you just need to maximize the negative distances, negative square distances, which is just minimizing, finding that mean mu L that minimizes the distance from a point to that mean, which minimizes the distance. Or equivalently, this is rather simple. For every point, you have a collection of k means. That's how the name comes up. You have a collection of k means. You find which point, which of these means is closest to this point, and you assign the corresponding label to this point. Let's call this yi. I'll refer to this as yi, but you should remember that this yi was generated according to your current estimate of the means. Yes?
So this step that you find the label that is closest to the mean is actually the thing that makes these algorithmic clustering happen?
Yep. Well, what makes this a clustering algorithm is at the end you get a clustering.
But what in the clustering you have, for example, you have some points that you want to assign each point. You have certain kind of points that you want to assign other points to that bucket. So you want to assign a point to a bucket that is closer to that bucket.
Right. In this case, this is how you're doing it. For k-means, you're defining closeness according to the L2 distance, the Euclidean distance. And the reason you're using the Euclidean distance is because it shows up in the power of the exponentiation function, and the reason you're getting the exponentiation is because you have a mixture of Gaussians. That's one way of interpreting this story. But end of the day, what we have now is for every point you have a label, and that label is the label that corresponds to the mean that is closest to it. And this is our E step in the hard EM algorithm. Remember that we're not computing a probability distribution over labels anymore. We are concentrating all the probability on this one label that is closest in the Euclidean distance. Questions about the E step? What's the next step? Well done. So the n step follows the same sort of pattern that we've always seen so far, and this must be starting to look somewhat familiar for you now. You want to maximize the expected log likelihood according to some, when expectation is taken according to some distribution, but now we've defined this distribution to be a peaked distribution of this kind. So first thing to do is write down the log likelihood. We know how to write the likelihood. P of xy is that this whole expression that comes from the Gaussian mixture model, and log likelihood, not surprisingly, is just log of that. And interestingly, it also has, because we're taking log, now the Euclidean distance shows up, and there's some interesting stuff happening here. Now, the next step 2 is to write down the expected log likelihood. In general, in real EM, this expectation would be over some distribution Q, IY. But now we've concentrated all probability mass on this one example, that minimizer. So, effectively, what that means is, remember that we want to find expectation over this L, which is Y in our case. But since all probability mass is concentrated on that particular label, only that remains in the expectation, everything else disappears. So the maximizing the sum of the expected log likelihood only retains that label that you previously assigned to this point. Questions? Yeah.
Sort of a tangentially related question, but so you're talking about how that squared, that's the Euclidean distance, comes from the squared and the norm. Do you get any sort of meaningful probability distributions if you take the normal and mess with the exponent?
Yeah, so if you take, if the exponent is the L1
Yeah.
now, then you get the Cauchy distribution.
Oh.
And yeah, you can play with those kinds of things. The normal is convenient because it's differentiable and it plays nice math-wise. The Cauchy distribution is a bit of a mess because it does not have all moments. The normal distribution has all its moments. Now, Cauchy, you cannot integrate over it. You cannot integrate higher moments. You cannot. So it's slightly less well-behaved in terms of math, and also in terms of optimizing L1 is a bit of a problem because L1 distance is not a differentiable function, so you might have to do a little bit more extra work. Yes?
Does the variance go away because of our simplifying assumption?
You know, actually no, I assume that the variances are all identity matrices.
Okay.
Otherwise the variance doesn't go away. And in fact, the variance remains roughly in the same way that the variance remains in your homework question. Meaning that it makes the math way more than one slide long. But yes, the intuitive way to think about it is if the variance is 1, it's, let's say it's the identity matrix, then you're pretending that all given a mean, all points of equal probability from that share equal probability are on circles around it. If the variance is not the identity matrix, let's say it's another something else, you get to ellipses. So you could find those variances and you try to find these ellipses that best explain the clusters. That's another important point to note. K-means assumes that the clusters are basically spherical. So we want to maximize this function with respect to theta, and theta is really the collection of all the mu's. I'm not going to derive this. I encourage you to do it unless somebody asks me to do it on the whiteboard. It's not terribly hard. It turns out, if you take the derivative with respect to, there are only k means here, k mu's. You can take the derivative with respect to each of those, set them to 0, and what you will get is the update rule, the mu L, should be set to the mean of all the points that were assigned label L. Okay? And that's also rather easy to see because all you need to do is take a derivative of this guy here. So this gives us our k-means algorithm. Let me write down the full algorithm. The input is a collection of points. So far I've been careful, at least in the slides, not to call this k-means because I wanted it to be a surprise. But it should be rather obvious. The input is a set of points. All the points are d-dimensional vectors. And another input is k. The number of labels that you believe, the number of clusters if you want, that you believe exists in this problem. you first initialize all the means randomly, and you should always remember that these means are d-dimensional vectors. And then you iterate. There is the E step, or the fake E step, where you label every point using the mean that is closest to it. So for every point you find the argmin, should not be k, it should be L, argmin over L of the Euclidean distance from the Lth mean to that point. So you've labeled every point. And then the next step, so this is basically a loop over your data points. Then you loop over every label, you find all the data points that have been labeled with that mean, and take the center, and call that the new mean for that, the new average for that cluster. And then you go back, label the points according to the new clustering, the new means, and iterate. And at some point you give up, you get bored, you feel that it is converged, you return the labels to all the points. Questions? Yes, and just to, in case you just woke up, this is the k-means algorithm. So the important thing I want you to notice here is this is a rather simple algorithm. It's about 10 lines of code if you actually do the whole thing. Not terribly hard to implement, but it has a rather neat interpretation in this probabilistic sense. But also, like with everything EM, this algorithm will fail if your data does not satisfy the assumptions. This algorithm can fail if your data does not satisfy the generative model that you assumed. So in general, that's true for all such probabilistic models. If you believe your data satisfies this generative model, then you're doing the right thing. If your data does not satisfy the generative model, all bets are off. There are people who've analyzed, if your data does not satisfy the generative model, what will happen, but it's not clear. Yes.
And so our underlying assumption of this was that it was generated from a distribution of Gaussian mixture models.
Yes. There are three modeling assumptions and one algorithmic assumption. The modeling assumption is this was generated using a Gaussian mixture model. Number two, all the k classes are equally likely. And number three, the variances are all identity matrices. The covariance matrices are all identical. From the algorithmic point of view, the assumption is that we are doing hard EM. If you had done, and in fact this is a good thing to think about, if you had done real EM instead of hard EM, what we have here will change ever so slightly. Basically there will be two changes effectively. There's one change in the E step, one in the M step. But it becomes what could be called a weighted EM. Instead of assigning all the mass to this one maximizer, you let all the points every point contribute, every label contribute to this label point. But so that's the algorithmic assumption for k-means, that you're doing hard assignments. Yeah.
What is the gain in having a multi-dimensional label? Which difference it will make if we have a one-dimensional?
What's a multi-dimensional label? So here, is this a multi-dimensional label? Just to clarify the notation.
You said that this is a matrix, so.
No, the label is one element, one of k things.
No, but there are k labels. Each of them has another dimension, or
no. The label is just a number, 1 to k. So let me work through an example run of k-means. This is a cartoon version, which is not necessarily mathematically right, but it gives the intuition. So let's say we have some cluster of points, and we don't know what to label them. So Do people agree? How many? How many? How many?
Or four.
Or 4. So that's an important point. You're making an assumption about the number of clusters. And very often you cannot paint all the points on two-dimensional surfaces. So you pick a number, hope it works, try a few others. Or if you are if you're feeling particularly clever about yourself, you could make that a parameter. Throw in a distribution over numbers. Now you get a larger joint model. Now your parameters include whatever, first you sample a number k from maybe a Poisson distribution or something, and then you pretend there are k means. So you get a much more complex model. This is, you have to rederive EM and do this whole thing again. And there's a big cottage industry of putting priors on top of priors on top of priors. That's 6. At some point you give up because it becomes computationally really terrible. But those of you who said 3, that was a good choice. I did pick 3. And let's say we start off with 3 randomly chosen means. The first step in k-means, so I'm going to iterate between the assignment and the recomputing the mean. So first what you do is, for every point, you find which mean is closest to it and color it with that. So I've colored all the points. And then the next step is to re-estimate these means. So you recompute the mean of the black points using these 4, and maybe it's this point here. For the red points, you recompute the mean. For the blue points, you recompute the mean. And now the means have moved. So now you're back to square one. You have 3 means and a bunch of unlabeled points. Again, you color the points, and using the nearest, according to the nearest mean, and you re-estimate the means. And then we are back to square one. We have 3 means, and we have a bunch of unlabeled points. Do the same thing, and then re-estimate the means, and at this point I've decided it's done because I got the clusters I wanted. Questions about the algorithm? Yes?
I have a question. This kind of more ties into dimensionality of dimension, but I mean, so it's very hard to visualize when you go beyond 3 dimensions.
Mm-hmm.
And so when doing that, do people tend to use like singular value decomposition?
Right. If we had more time, I would be talking about principal components analysis. But yes, there are 2 answers there. One, first of all, irrespective of what you do, it's very hard to visualize many dimensions, especially even if you do SVD and you get, let's say, the top 20 singular values to preserve all the information. How do you visualize 20-dimensional points? So there are tricks around this. If you talk to the deep learning people these days, they prefer something called TSNE, which tries to project points. There's a whole battery of algorithms on visualizing these things, and honestly I find them all to be somewhat difficult to work with. All of them have their pluses, but implicitly in projecting these things to the 2-dimensional space, they make assumptions that you may or may not care about. So it's generally a hard thing to answer. But the first thing that I typically end up trying is doing PCA, taking the top 2 directions and seeing if anything works. And I must confess, so far it's never worked. I don't know why. Maybe it's just the data that I play with. So let me wrap up this bit about unsupervised learning. In maybe the last 3 or 4 lectures, I've given you a flavor of unsupervised learning. This is simultaneously a vast, relatively unexplored area, and there is a lot of work in this. And what we saw was, and it comes under different names. It comes under unsupervised learning, clustering, learning with missing labels, latent variables, or hidden variables, hidden labels. There's this general sense of something being obscured and you're trying to find it. partial supervision, so indirect, implicit, incidental, and all those kind of things. So the granddaddy of all the algorithms in this area is the EM. I called it the EM algorithm, but I want to emphasize that it's not a single algorithm, it's a recipe for making algorithms. And it alternates between this E step and the M step. The E step is basically fill up the rest of the structure, the rest of the input, and the M step is re-estimate the parameters. And it comes with some interesting guarantees. In particular, you converse to local maxima. One way of thinking about unsupervised learning is it's exactly the same as clustering. And many clustering algorithms. We've only seen k-means, but there are as many clustering algorithms as there are probabilistic models. So basically a lot. And you might, depending on what your interest is, you might have, or you might come across algorithms that talk about with names like latent Dirichlet allocation or latent semantic analysis and that kind of stuff, or there's this whole area of Bayesian learning which effectively talks about estimating these kind of unseen variables. We saw k-means, which is an instance of hard EM, but again, depending on your probabilistic assumption, you could get a different learning algorithm. Questions? Yes.
So it's like k-means in general depends on Euclidean distance.
Yes.
So does that mean that higher dimensionality it kind of falls apart?
That's hard to say. It's not clear, to be honest. There are many problems here which include dimensionality because of dimensionality. There's the problem of sparsity of your points. What if most of the features are irrelevant? Noise hurts you more in high dimensions. So yeah, there are all these problems that will hurt us when we use k-means. But the good thing about k-means is that there are ridiculously efficient implementations of k-means out there. Which is why most people, they want to do clustering, they throw k-means at it and see what comes. If you want to do clustering, the first thing you should try is k-means. Because very often that will be good enough. Sometimes it won't. As often as it's good enough, it won't be good enough. But then you have to think about it. Yeah.
So one weird thing that here we had was we find the distance between our data and our label.
But we don't find the distance between our data and the label. For every label, we have a mean. We find the distance between the data point and the mean associated with that label.
Yeah, but this does not make sense for me in the way that the label and the data might be completely of different types.
No, you make sure that they are of the same type because the mean corresponds to the cluster center. So it's in the same space.
Yeah, but what if it is not like that? For example, what if our data and the label was completely of different?
Then you need a mapping. Yeah, you need some sort of a mapping. And here the mapping is basically just a table. From the label, you have k-means. You have a table which says for mean number 1, for label number 1, there is
This number.
yeah. Here the mapping is a table. You could be clever and come up with more interesting mappings. All right, in the 5 or 6 minutes that are left, I'm obviously not going to finish dimensionality reduction, but I just want to give you a flavor of what exists in that space. These are things that you may have seen before, so which is also the reason why I put it to the end. And if you haven't seen it before, you will see it in. The general question that we want to address is the following. So far, we've seen what is learning, how do you measure learnability, and the main lesson I want you to take home from that is learning equals generalization. Learning is the ability to do well on future unseen examples, previously unseen examples. And we saw a couple of different ways of quantifying what learnability is. We looked at PAC learning, we looked at Bayesian criteria, and for each of these we have different learning algorithms. And towards the end, we looked at the case when what if you don't have fully labeled data. In everything that we did so far, we assume that we are given some feature vector. The input is always we are given some feature representation, and then let's go with it. And the question that many of you asked me through the semester is, where do those features come from? You were more polite than what I might have implied. But that's an important question, because, and the answer that I have typically said is, it comes from domain knowledge. Somebody out there, you are an expert in, I don't know, computational finance, so you know exactly that these are the 2000 things that are relevant for this stock ticker. That's an extremely unsatisfying point, and if you have any hopes that I will resolve that in the next 4 minutes, you'll be disappointed. Because the answer is, honestly, we don't know. There are a few different strategies for this, and since I'm not going to talk about it, I'm going to let you guys explore these slides, and you can email me questions and stuff like that. The one strategy is called feature selection, where I don't know what features are good. Let me just go wild and throw everything I can think of into this feature vector. And then I'm going to now start looking for subsets of this feature set that best classifies this. So you could do this greedily by starting off with nothing and then growing your feature set iteratively at each step, hoping that it gets better. Or you could start off with the full set and then start pruning features. These are called forward and backward selection. Or you could throw in a regularizer. Remember that a regularizer is a function that penalizes complex models. It pushes the weights towards 0. So pushing the weights towards 0 is effectively, if it's equal to 0, it's getting rid of that feature. So adding more juice into your regularizer effectively does feature selection. But maybe you don't want to use Euclidean L2 regularizers, that is W transpose W, the 2 norm. What you really want is a count of the number of features, that is the 0 norm. L0 is it's NP hard to optimize L0. So a good proxy, it turns out, is another hot area of research, L1 norm minimization. It's work that goes back to, it depends on whom you ask, it goes back many decades or it goes back about 4 years. But L1 minimization has this property of preferring sparser models, just like Winnow, by the way. And interestingly, the learning curves for L1 and Winnow look somewhat similar, and it's not clear what's going on. This is one way of thinking about features. Throw in everything and then have this additional thing in your learning, either as an external step of feature selection or as an internal step in the form of regularization that picks the right features. Another way of thinking about feature selection is throw in everything into your feature set. You have like a million-dimensional feature space. You project it down to a low-dimensional space using standard operations from linear algebra, like principal components analysis, linear projections, and your classifier only operates on these low-dimensional spaces. The reason that is good is because all your bounds depend on the number of dimensions. And then there's a third really hot ongoing area of work, which is using neural networks, which end up doing actually features this sort of dimensionality reduction, but in a nonlinear way. But these are the kinds of things I would have talked about if I had more time. I encourage you to go over it with the caveat that this is very clearly not the complete picture. So if you have any questions about this, I'll be happy to discuss them. And in general, this might be useful if you want to implement these things in practice. Right, I'll stop now. In the next lecture, I plan to talk about how to use all these ideas in the world, in practice.
Okay, you want to start with